A TSA officer mocked a black CEO at security with a cruel prank. Seconds later, the CEO's response set off alarms across the entire terminal. He thought mocking a man's appearance would make him powerful. He didn't realize the person he targeted could expose every lie with one move. Subscribe if you believe cruelty always meets its consequence. The comment came just as Dr. Rowan Vance handed over his identification. "Private defense?" the officer muttered, barely glancing up from the badge. His voice was neutral, too neutral, like a question dressed as an insult. Rowan gave a single, polite nod, his movements practiced and composed. "Corvion Dynamics," he said quietly. "I'm en route to Arcton for a federal cybersecurity initiative." The terminal of Haverline International pulsed with noise and motion, rolling suitcases, murmured conversations, the occasional ding of a boarding announcement. But in that narrow corridor between velvet ropes and TSA screening booths, everything around Rowan slowed. The officer's nameplate read Marshal Garrett Lorne, and Garrett Lorne did not like what he saw. Behind his seemingly routine motions, scanning IDs, checking tickets, waving people through, there was a tightness in his jaw that hadn't been there seconds before. His eyes lingered too long on the title stamped beneath Rowan's name, CEO, Corvion Dynamics. "Corporate elites always cutting the line," Garrett said under his breath, just loud enough for Rowan to hear, just quiet enough to keep it deniable. He slid Rowan's ID back with a little more force than necessary, the plastic skimming across the inspection desk. Rowan didn't respond. He took the ID calmly and moved forward, his expression unreadable, his bright blue suit immaculate even in the airport's harsh fluorescent light. His mind was already working, not on the insult, but on the detail behind it, the type of resentment that wasn't born overnight. Something personal was underneath this officer's tone. As he reached the next checkpoint, Garrett followed. It wasn't standard. Officers usually rotated lanes or remained posted. But Garrett moved with purpose, issuing a subtle nod to the guard stationed ahead. The other man, a younger officer with sandy brown hair and uncertain posture, shifted aside without argument. The extra baggage check came next. "Sir, step aside for random inspection," Garrett announced, though Rowan hadn't even triggered the scanner. Rowan blinked once. "Is there a flag on the system?" "No flag. Just routine." Then, "It's routine," Garrett repeated, louder this time, cutting him off. His voice sliced through the murmur of the terminal. A few nearby passengers glanced over. Rowan said nothing. He stepped aside. His carry-on was placed on the metal table. Garrett opened it with dramatic care, sifting through documents, cables, a carefully packed encrypted drive. He lifted the drive, turned it in the air like he didn't recognize its function, then placed it down near a nearby terminal. Rowan's eyes followed closely. A small red light blinked on a device mounted under the desk, one that wasn't part of the regular setup. A secondary camera. Recording. The younger officer returned, Jensen Vale, his name tag read, and stood silently near Rowan, offering nothing but an awkward shift of weight between his feet. Garrett hummed as he opened a smaller compartment. "You people really love control, don't you?" Rowan folded his hands in front of him. "Excuse me?" Garrett looked up, eyes gleaming faintly. "You know, systems, rules, procedures. Always think you're the smartest guy in the room." "I value structure," Rowan said simply. "So should anyone working security." Garrett smiled, if one could call it that. His lips barely moved, but the malice was unmistakable. Then he reached toward Rowan's face. "Glasses off. Need to inspect those." Rowan complied, removing the sleek black frames and placing them gently on the tray. Garrett picked them up, turning them slowly between his fingers. "Never thought a beard could look that expensive," he murmured, eyes trailing along Rowan's jaw with deliberate slowness. Several passengers were watching now. One of them, a businessman in a gray jacket, frowned and muttered something to his partner. Another traveler, a teenager wearing headphones, pulled one bud out to hear better. Rowan stayed quiet. He knew how this game was played. A public space, a uniform, a provocation hidden in professionalism. He had seen it before, in boardrooms and hearings, and now, evidently, at the gates of Federal Transit. But Garrett didn't stop. He lingered over every item, pulled out cables, flicked through documents he wasn't supposed to read. Rowan's encrypted badge, clearly marked with federal clearance, was scanned twice, both times accompanied by a raised eyebrow and a muttered comment. "Name like Vance, gotta wonder who you were born to impress," Garrett said. Rowan's voice remained even. "I was born to build." "Not impress." Garrett leaned in slightly, lips curling. "Well." "You built a fine beard." At least his hand reached into his own chest pocket and retrieved a metal lighter. The click echoed louder than it should have in the terminal's chaos. Flame burst upward in a narrow stream, dancing in the space between them. Jensen stiffened. "Garrett?" "Relax," Garrett said, waving the flame a few inches from Rowan's face. "It's just a joke. Man's got product in that thing." I'm curious what would happen if it caught Rowan's eyes locked on the flame. He didn't move, didn't flinch, only tilted his head slightly, watching Garrett not directly, but in the reflection of the polished metal tray nearby. His own heartbeat slowed. Years of engineering war systems had taught him something about pressure. The loudest threats were usually the weakest. But Garrett's hand didn't tremble. His smile didn't waver, and the flame inched closer. Jensen looked panicked now. "Sir, we should move him along." "This is going too far." But Garrett didn't answer. He leaned in, the lighter still alight. "Let's see what burns first, your pride or your patience." And Rowan knew. This wasn't random. It wasn't about baggage or identification or federal clearance. This was about someone trying to provoke a reaction. Rowan's fingers moved slightly, not toward aggression, but toward memory. He had spent the last month tracing suspicious data packets bouncing through secured airport networks. The leaks weren't from outside. They were coming from within. Someone had buried them under routine protocol. Someone like Garrett. Someone who didn't expect the man in the bright blue suit to be anything more than a headline waiting to happen. What Garrett didn't know, what no one knew, was that Rowan wasn't here just to fly. He was here to confirm a theory. And Garrett Lorne had just confirmed it with a flick of his thumb. The flame hovered. Passengers held their breath. And Rowan, perfectly still, allowed a single thought to rise in his mind, calm and unshaken. Sometimes, the calmest man in line is the one holding the storm. The briefcase hit the metal inspection table with a thud sharper than necessary. Officer Garrett Lorne's fingers moved deliberately over the latches, flicking them open with a touch that felt more like invasion than procedure. He didn't say a word at first, only exhaled sharply through his nose as he began pulling apart each compartment. The lining of the case was peeled back. Rowan's stylus, his encrypted drive, even a folded paper of handwritten notes, each item handled with a disdainful kind of care. "Any reason this drive is encrypted?" Garrett finally asked, not looking up. Rowan's voice was quiet, even. "Because it contains proprietary data related to national defense initiatives." As noted on my federal clearance badge, Garrett smirked, tossing the pen aside before carefully lifting the drive with 2 fingers, holding it toward the overhead scanner. A small beep echoed, but then Rowan saw it, reflected faintly in the monitor behind the inspection belt. A second camera, smaller, half hidden behind the standard security frame, was running independently. It wasn't part of the routine checkpoint feed. He tilted his head slightly, just enough to catch the angle. The lens was aimed not at the conveyor belt, but directly at the drive in Garrett's hand. Surveillance. Unofficial. Targeted. Rowan's jaw tensed, though his expression remained unreadable. "Is that part of protocol now?" he asked softly, nodding slightly toward the monitor. Garrett glanced at the screen but didn't miss a beat. "Protocol," he said flatly, letting the drive drop to the table with a quiet clack. "You people love control, don't you?" The way he said "you people" wasn't loud, but it sliced through the air with surgical precision. Several passengers in the nearby line heard it, and a few exchanged uncertain glances. Rowan noticed. He noticed everything, but said nothing. His silence was deliberate, studied. Officer Jensen Vale stood nearby, visibly uncomfortable. Young, probably early 30s, with a neat haircut and eyes that didn't yet know how to hide hesitation. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other and cleared his throat. "Garrett, we should move him along," Jensen muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Garrett ignored him. Instead, he picked up Rowan's passport, turned it over twice, and then, accidentally, let it slip from his hand. The document fell face down on the floor with a soft slap, landing inches from a yellow caution sign marked "Wet Floor." Rowan bent down without a word, retrieving the passport with slow precision. When he straightened, he looked directly into Garrett's eyes. "Professionalism used to mean something," he said, voice even, unshaken. Garrett raised his eyebrows but offered no reply. Instead, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small metal lighter, sleek, silver, engraved along the edge. He flicked it open with a loud clink, letting the flame dance briefly in the air between them. "You ever wonder," Garrett said casually, stepping closer, "how much product it takes to keep this thing neat?" He tilted his chin toward Rowan's beard, the flame still alive in his hand. Time slowed. Rowan didn't move, but his eyes narrowed, calculating. Behind Garrett, Jensen stiffened. His voice came strained, almost alarmed. "Garrett, cut it out. That's not funny." The passengers nearby froze, attention locked. One man instinctively pulled out his phone, holding it low but angled forward. Another stepped back from the line altogether. The flicking of the lighter resumed. Off, on, off, on. Each burst of flame like a metronome counting down to something unspeakable. Rowan's fingers moved slightly toward his lapel, not to reach for anything but to keep his hands visible and calm. "I've met arrogance before," Rowan said softly, "but very few men try to weaponize it while smiling." Garrett didn't flinch. He leaned closer, and for a breathless second the flame hovered just inches from Rowan's beard. The faint scent of gasoline mixed with cologne and institutional floor polish. Tension cracked the air like ice underfoot. Jensen stepped forward. "Sir, that's enough," he shouted, louder this time, a note of panic in his tone. "Cameras are rolling." Still, Garrett didn't pull away. His tone dropped low, venomous. "You think you're better than everyone here? Let's see what burns first, your pride or your patience." There was a beat. Then Rowan inhaled slowly, deeply. His voice was a whisper, but it carried. "Respect isn't requested, it's revealed." The hiss of a flame sliced through the tense quiet. A narrow arc of fire shot upward, its glow flickering dangerously close to Rowan Vance's face. The scent of butane mingled with the sterile chill of airport air. Conversations ceased. Gasps rippled outward. All eyes turned to the checkpoint where a single moment threatened to detonate into something irreversible. Garrett Lorne held the lighter steady, the open flame trembling inches from Rowan's meticulously kept beard. His expression strained with a false smile, stretched too wide, hiding something sharp underneath. "Relax," Garrett muttered loud enough for nearby travelers to hear. "Just making sure your grooming isn't flammable." He laughed, an empty, performative sound, but his hand didn't move back. If anything, it edged closer. Rowan didn't blink. He stood still, his posture unnaturally calm, almost statuesque. But behind his stillness was motion. His mind was already racing. Calculation overtook fear. Observation overrode emotion. He shifted his gaze, not to Garrett's face but to the reflection shimmering in the metal inspection tray beside him. It gave him the angle he needed. The flame, Garrett's wrist, the slight twitch in his shoulder muscles, the shallow rise in breath. tells of instability, of intent. A bead of sweat slipped down Garrett's temple. The lighter trembled in his hand. Whether from adrenaline or anticipation, it was unclear. "Stop that, Garrett," came a voice from behind the checkpoint. Jensen Vale, the younger officer, had seen enough. His voice cracked with urgency. "Cameras are rolling." But Garrett didn't stop. He pressed forward another inch, voice low, eyes locked onto Rowan's. "You think you're better than everyone here? Better than me?" His tone carried something primal, something past jealousy, resentment cloaked in mockery. "Let's see what burns first, your pride or your patience." The flame wavered, then surged closer. Rowan smelled it first, the faintest curl of heat-kissed hair. His beard had caught the barest singe, enough to whisper danger to his senses, but not enough to ignite. Still, the message was clear. This was no longer a game, if it ever had been. In the half-second that followed, Rowan made a decision. His left hand snapped upward. No warning, no hesitation. He caught Garrett's wrist mid-air and twisted it sideways, wrenching the lighter hand upward with an efficiency that spoke of training. The crowd gasped again, but Rowan moved with precision, not violence. His grip didn't shatter bones. It redirected pressure. His right hand snapped forward and pinned Garrett's fingers against the ignition, keeping the flame alive. But now it faced upward, toward Garrett's own collar. Fabric met fire. There was a muffled thump as the nylon trim of Garrett's uniform hissed and curled, a black patch instantly blooming on his shoulder. The officer yelped in shock, stumbling backward as smoke curled up around his face. The smell of scorched synthetic fibers bit into the air. His arms flailed, trying to bat away the heat that had already marked him. Jensen rushed forward, grabbing a fire extinguisher from behind the barrier. "Get back! Garrett, stay down!" he shouted, pulling the trigger with shaking hands. A white plume of suppressant hissed over the smoking uniform, dulling the edges of chaos. But it was too late. The fire alarm shrieked. A piercing, metallic cry rang out across the terminal, cutting through the building like a siren of judgment. Within seconds, overhead sprinklers burst open, cascading icy water onto passengers, personnel, and polished floors. Chaos erupted. People screamed. Some ducked. Others ran. Rowan didn't move. He stood drenched, droplets streaking down the fabric of his bright blue suit, now clinging to his shoulders like a second skin. His gaze never left Garrett, who knelt now, coughing, face red, hair soaked, and eyes wild with disbelief. The lighter lay smoldering beside him, forgotten. Security officers swarmed in from the far end of the terminal, barking commands. "Hands up," one yelled. "Step back," another shouted, weapon holstered but hand poised. The response was swift, automatic, but Rowan raised his hands calmly, palms outward. "Review the footage before you accuse me," he said evenly. His voice was neither frightened nor defiant. It was steady, grounded. The flame wasn't mine. A medic pushed through the forming crowd, kneeling beside Garrett, whose burned collar still smoked faintly despite the dousing. His chest heaved with short, shocked breaths. Through the dispersing mist, footsteps approached with urgency. Trent Maller, Rowan's assistant, slipped past the security rope, coat half-buttoned and soaked from the sprinklers. "Sir, what happened?" Trent's voice cracked as he took in the scene. The smoldering collar, the panicked bystanders, the officers shouting. Rowan didn't turn away from Garrett. His eyes held something colder now, not fury, but clarity. He spoke quietly, almost too softly for the others to hear. "An officer mistook fire for authority." Trent flinched, not at the words, but at the weight behind them. Across the terminal, a tall figure watched from the edge of the chaos. Commander Reese Doran, the supervisor overseeing airport operations, stood with arms folded. His gaze flicked between Rowan and the fallen officer, his mind already calculating public fallout, procedural failures, and the media storm that would undoubtedly follow. His lips tightened into a line. This wouldn't stay contained for long. As medics lifted Garrett onto a stretcher, Rowan stepped aside to let them pass. The crowd parted instinctively around him, not in fear, but in awe. Water dripped from his shoulders. His hair was slicked back, his suit ruined. But his spine was unbroken. His hands had been raised not in surrender, but in control. Garrett groaned as he was wheeled away, his burned collar stiff and scorched. He turned his head slightly, eyes meeting Rowan's one final time through a haze of pain and shame. Rowan bent slightly at the waist, not in mockery, but in finality. His voice cut through the remaining din with razor clarity. "You lit the match. You'll live with the firewater crashed from the ceiling in sudden sheets, soaking everything in its path." The fire alarm howled through the terminal in pulsing, shrill bursts that sent travelers scattering in all directions. Screams blended with the screeching metallic rumble of rolling suitcases and the staccato thumps of panicked footsteps on tile. But in the eye of the chaos stood Rowan Vance, still as stone, unmoving beneath the downpour. His bright blue suit darkened by the water, his gaze fixed on the man now collapsed at his feet. Garrett Lorne writhed on the floor, clutching his shoulder where the flame had seared through the edge of his uniform. Smoke still curled faintly from the blackened patch, its acrid scent mixing with the sterile tang of sprinkler water and burnt nylon. His eyes were wide with pain and something else, shock. The arrogance that had curled his lips moments ago was gone, replaced by trembling disbelief. A loud hiss erupted as a nearby extinguisher blasted foam across Garrett's shoulder. Jensen Vale, the younger officer who had protested earlier, was on his knees beside him, his hands shaking as he tried to cool the burn. "Stay still," Jensen shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. "Help's on the way." Through it all, Rowan stood just a few feet back. His hands were relaxed at his sides, his chest rising steadily despite being drenched. His face revealed nothing but a calm that unnerved even those who weren't sure what had just happened. He didn't look angry. He didn't look proud. He looked resolved, as if he had already calculated the consequences of the moment and accepted them. Heavy boots pounded toward him. 4 uniformed airport security guards rushed in, forming a half-circle with weapons half-drawn and voices booming. "Hands where we can see them," one of them barked, aiming directly at Rowan's chest. Rowan raised his arms slowly, not out of fear, but precision. "Review the footage before you accuse me," he said clearly, his voice cutting through the sirens and commotion like a blade. His eyes, unblinking, locked onto the nearest officer's visor. "Everything is recorded." For a beat, no one moved. Then one guard hesitated, lowering his weapon slightly. Another scanned the overhead cameras. Somewhere in the back of their minds, even amid the panic, they knew Rowan Vance wasn't just any passenger. His face, his credentials, the way he stood, it all told them that they were in the middle of something bigger than it appeared. Medics arrived seconds later, pushing through the crowd with stretchers and oxygen kits. Garrett's moans echoed faintly, drowned by the loudspeaker's looping alarm. His uniform, once crisp and authoritative, now clung to him like a melted shell. Foam coated his sleeve. A medic knelt beside him, lifting his wrist to check for shock. Garrett tried to speak but winced instead, his face contorted in pain. From across the crowd, a man's voice called out sharply, "Rowan!" Trent Maller shoved through a cluster of bystanders, his dress shirt spotted with water as he reached his boss. His expression was half panicked, half relieved. "Sir, what happened?" Rowan didn't shift his posture. He tilted his head slightly, letting water stream from his brow as he answered with calm finality. An officer mistook fire for authority. Trent's eyes widened at the sight of the chaos, the scorched uniform, the burned tile, the stunned security detail still frozen between protocol and confusion. But he said nothing more. He knew Rowan too well to expect dramatics. If Rowan had chosen not to run, not to shout, not to escalate, it was because something larger was already in motion. At the edge of the crowd, another figure emerged. older, with a clipped gray beard and a uniform bearing more stripes than the rest. Commander Rhys Doran surveyed the wreckage with the cold eyes of a man trained to calculate optics before emotion. His gaze swept over Garrett's charred collar, the smoke still curling from the floor, and finally landed on Rowan. They locked eyes, one calculating the story he would need to spin, the other daring him to try. Doran approached slowly, hands behind his back, and said nothing. His presence was meant to stabilize the scene, but his silence spoke volumes. He wasn't there to ask what happened. He was there to assess how far the truth would spread before they could contain it. "Get him out of here," Rhys said curtly to the medics. "Get statements from all nearby officers and passengers. I want every inch of this checkpoint reviewed frame by frame." Garrett was lifted onto the stretcher, weakly gripping the rails as painkillers began to dull his expression. His face twisted, not from the burn, but from the humiliation. He had gone too far, and now the narrative was out of his hands. As the stretcher rolled past, Rowan stepped forward just enough for his voice to carry. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. "The difference between us," he said softly, "is I burn to protect, not destroy." The door slammed behind Rowan with a mechanical finality. Fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a sterile glow across the narrow holding office. Water still clung to his soaked blue suit, dripping onto the linoleum floor in slow, deliberate taps. He did not sit. He didn't pace. He stood tall, silent, steady, like a man made of stone, or perhaps something that had already walked through fire. Across the table, Officer Laren Pike pressed play on the terminal for the third time. The footage began again. The crowded terminal. Garrett Lorne stepping into Rowan's space, the flick of the lighter, the rising tension. But just as the flame edged close to Rowan's beard, the video cut to a different angle, one obscured, slightly skewed, and clearly positioned to miss the crucial moment. Lorne leaned back, his chair creaking beneath him. "You see the risk here, Mr. Vance?" Rowan didn't blink. "I see a deliberate omission." Lorne sighed and scratched the edge of his clipboard with a pen cap, eyes flicking up but never quite meeting Rowan's. "We're verifying all feeds. It might have been a power glitch. Camera 12. Rowan's voice was low, firm. "It's the only one that had a direct line of sight. And it went offline precisely when the lighter sparked. Not before, not after." Seconds before Lorne shifted in his seat, uncomfortable under the gaze of a man who wasn't pleading but probing. Rowan's words didn't sound like the defense of a guilty man. They sounded like the precision of an engineer diagnosing a fault line. Outside, through the frosted glass panel, faint murmurs grew louder. Reporters, probably dozens of them. Their muffled questions bled into each other. Was it arson? Did the CEO attack an officer? Was it a political statement? Hysteria built from fragments, each headline birthing a wilder version of events. Rowan heard none of it. His mind was elsewhere. "Why would someone tamper with a security feed inside a federal airport?" he asked, more to the room than to Pike. Lorne didn't answer. Rowan finally sat down, his movements slow but deliberate. His eyes bore into the investigators. This wasn't random. That officer, Garrett, he didn't act alone. He was baiting me, and someone made sure the angle that would clear me went dark at the exact moment I needed it. Lorne hesitated, then offered a vague shrug. "Garrett Lorne's been with TSA for 7 years. Spotless record." "Until he tried to set fire to my face," Rowan replied, his tone as cold as the room. "Check again." Lorne stood and turned away, as if sorting files. But Rowan watched the reflection in the dark monitor on the wall. Lorne's hands trembled slightly. Not enough for the untrained to notice, but Rowan had spent years reading body language across boardrooms and government briefings. Something was off. "You're not protecting Garrett," Rowan said slowly. "You're protecting whoever gave him clearance." Silence pressed into the corners of the room. Lorne finally turned back, his tone clipped. "Mr. Vance, you've been released pending further review." But I suggest you avoid public comment until the full investigation concludes. For your own safety, Rowan stood. Safety is an illusion when truth is denied oxygen. He moved toward the door, pausing just before it opened. Behind him, the footage still looped, the same incomplete truth playing like a half-buried secret. Outside the room, the hallway buzzed with tension. 2 federal agents flanked him, leading him through narrow corridors toward an exit shielded from the press. But even there, Rowan caught glimpses of cameras, the flashes leaking through blinds like lightning before a storm. Trent Maller was waiting by the side exit, his face pale but determined. "It's chaos out there," he said, lowering his voice. "Some are calling you a threat to national security. Others think you're a hero. I'm neither," Rowan said. "I'm just awake." Trent handed him a clean towel, which Rowan barely used before tucking it under his arm. They walked toward the parking garage, the underground passage echoing each footstep. "You think someone higher up was behind it?" Trent asked. Rowan didn't answer right away. He watched a janitor sweep shattered glass near the exit, remnants of the fire alarm incident. Somewhere in that chaos had been a plan, timed and layered, and he'd walked into it wearing a target on his chest and a beard someone tried to burn. "I think someone wanted me discredited before Arcton," Rowan said finally, "before I could present Guardian Vault to the Council." Garrett didn't act on impulse. He acted on instructions. Trent glanced at him sideways. "You think it's about the project?" Rowan nodded. Guardian Vault cuts off backdoor access to national servers. Makes certain contracts obsolete. Contracts currently held by people with friends in very high places, they reached the vehicle. Before climbing in, Rowan turned one last time toward the terminal. Helicopters hovered overhead, cameras pointed down like vultures. His soaked suit clung to him still, but his resolve was dry and sharp. As they drove off, the cityscape blurred behind fogged windows, but Rowan's thoughts were crystalline. The power outage, the missing footage, Garrett's oddly specific provocation, it all added up. Inside his mind, Rowan wasn't angry. He was charting the smoke, because smoke meant fire. And every fire, no matter how carefully started or hidden, always left a trail. As they turned toward the expressway, Trent broke the silence. "What now?" Rowan looked straight ahead, his eyes cold and clear. Every fire leaves smoke, and smoke always leads back to its source. Rain tapped steadily against the glass as Rowan Vance stared at his laptop screen, the glow painting faint shadows across his face. The echo of water still clung to his thoughts, remnants of the earlier chaos at Haverline Terminal. His blue suit, now dry but creased and stiff from the earlier downpour of sprinklers, lay folded over the armrest beside him. In the background, the city pulsed with distant sirens and muted traffic, but inside his apartment, silence carried weight. Trent Maller paced restlessly near the floor-to-ceiling window, his phone in one hand and a tablet in the other, scanning news feeds with growing agitation. "They're twisting it," he said, voice sharp with frustration. "One outlet is calling it an arson attempt. Another's spinning it as an unprovoked assault. They've got footage, cropped, silent, looped, and everyone's filling in the gaps with their own version." Rowan didn't flinch. Reclining in his chair, he clicked through folders on his portable drive, his movements precise. "Let them speak first," he said evenly. "Truth always sounds quieter, but it lasts longer." He inserted the encrypted drive into the side port of his laptop, eyes narrowing as code scrolled across the screen. These weren't ordinary files. This was a backup pulled from Corvion's internal monitoring system, one he had quietly arranged weeks ago during the early signs of sabotage. He filtered through the logs, isolating timestamps and metadata from the exact hour of the incident. The screen blinked. There it was. "Camera 12, he muttered, leaning forward. "What's that?" Trent asked, turning. Rowan pointed to a line of code flashing in red. "This is the security feed directly facing the checkpoint." According to airport reports, it went offline seconds before Garrett struck the lighter. Trent frowned. "They said it was a power glitch. Rowan didn't look away from the screen. No, this wasn't random. Look at the command history. Remote access. External override. You're saying someone shut it down, on purpose? Rowan's jaw tightened. Someone used me as bait. His fingers tapped the keyboard with growing speed, chasing the trail upstream. Each line of data became a breadcrumb, each server ping a thread in the trap that had been laid for him. He followed IP addresses, firewall pings, and bypass codes until one name finally surfaced from the digital fog. Halden Rice, Deputy Security Director, a name he had barely registered in the chaos of federal briefings. But now it glared back at him like a glowing ember. He clicked a link and pulled up Rice's dossier, public enough to access, but guarded. His connections to rival defense firms weren't immediately evident, but Rowan knew how to read between the lines. Rice had served briefly on the board of a private security conglomerate that had bid against Corvian 6 months ago. That contract had gone to Corvian instead, thanks to Rowan's airtight encryption model, now known as Guardian Vault. "They couldn't beat us," Rowan whispered, "so they tried to burn me instead." Trent stepped closer. "So, what now? You go to the press?" Rowan shook his head slowly. "No, that's what they want. A spectacle. Something loud and unstable they can point to. We do this methodically." He opened a secondary terminal window, drawing up a virtual map of network relays. The log showed that someone inside the TSA's own tech division had pushed an override command to disable Camera 12, 10 seconds before Rowan stepped into view. The source matched Rice's admin access, bounced through multiple firewalls, then routed through a scrubbed proxy. "Whoever Rice hired to do this," Rowan said, "was good, but not clean." He set an encryption flag on the discovery and synced it to Corvion's internal vault. "I need to create redundancy. If anything happens to this system, the logs survive." Trent watched him carefully. "What if they come after us again?" Rowan didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned the city skyline, each tower a silhouette against the low-hanging storm clouds. His own building was shielded, secured under his firm's counterintelligence safeguards. But safety was never just about bricks and glass. "It's not if," he said finally, "it's when." But now we know who's behind the curtain. The rain intensified outside, streaking the windows like falling code. Rowan stood and crossed to the far cabinet, pulling out a slim encrypted chip the size of a fingernail. He slid it into a portable drive and sealed it inside a biometric casing. Turning, he handed it to Trent. "This holds the raw data, the breach, the shutdown, Rice's access logs. If they try to erase the trail, this survives." Trent took it with both hands, nodding slowly. "You think this goes all the way to the council?" Rowan's voice dropped. "I think they don't want to see it, because if they do, they'll have to act. And in politics, silence is easier than accountability." He returned to his desk and clicked the screen off. The room dimmed instantly, the only light coming from the city's glow and the reflection in the glass. "Rice thought this would discredit me," Rowan murmured, "but he gave me everything I need. All I have to do now is strike where it smolders." Trent stood near the window watching lights flicker in nearby buildings. "What do you call this next move?" Rowan didn't turn around. Justice, delivered through evidence, not flame. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight. Outside, the wind shifted, pushing sheets of rain against the glass like nature urging him forward. Somewhere across the city, Garrett Lorne lay sedated in a hospital bed, numb to the ripples he had helped unleash. But Rowan wasn't thinking about Garrett anymore. His eyes were fixed on a deeper burn, a rot buried in silence and rank. He whispered it to the empty room, more to himself than anyone else. "You burn truth, and it lights the way forward." "They told me not to talk to you," Jensen Vale whispered, the words barely audible over the low murmur of the coffee shop crowd. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted his cup, knuckles pale against the paper sleeve. His eyes, restless, twitching, kept darting toward the entrance as if expecting someone to storm in at any moment. Rowan Vance sat across from him, expression unreadable, one hand resting on the polished wood table, the other slowly sliding a small recorder from his coat pocket. He didn't activate it. Not yet. Just placing it down was enough to shift the weight of the conversation. His presence, calm and deliberate, made the corner booth feel smaller than it was. The morning sunlight spilling through the fogged window framed him in muted gold. His bright blue suit, still damp from last night's rain, bore the silent stains of everything he'd endured, but his voice was steady. "Then, tell me off record," he said quietly. Jensen hesitated. For a long moment he simply stared at the recorder like it might explode. The tension in his shoulders betrayed the war inside him, between fear and conscience. Finally, he exhaled and leaned in, lowering his voice. "Marshal Lorne didn't act on his own," he said, his words tight, rehearsed, like he'd repeated them 100 times in his head before today. "He was told to push you. Make it public. Make you crack. The orders came from higher up. Deputy Director Halden Rice Rowan didn't blink. He simply let the words sink into the silence. They said your project, Guardian Vault, was blocking some high-dollar contracts. Systems they wanted installed without oversight," Jensen continued, his voice shaking now. "They needed a reason to pull you off the council's shortlist. Something loud enough to bury your credibility." Rowan's jaw tightened. He leaned back slightly, letting his hand drift to the edge of the table. For a moment, the only sound was the clinking of dishes behind the counter, the low hum of the espresso machine, the steady thud of a bus passing outside. "What about the missing feed?" he asked at last, eyes narrowing. Jensen looked down, ashamed. "Camera 12? It wasn't a glitch," he confessed. "Halden ordered the blackout just before you entered the checkpoint. He said something about plausible deniability. Said if no one saw the lighter, you'd look like the aggressor in everything that followed." There it was. Confirmation, not suspicion, not conjecture. A planned takedown, surgical and calculated. Rowan reached into his coat pocket again and pulled out a small encrypted chip, sliding it across the table slowly, deliberately. Jensen looked at it like it was radioactive. "This holds logs from Corvian's remote mirror of the surveillance uplink," Rowan said. "Not everything was erased." Jensen blinked, stunned. You mirrored airport security?" Rowan didn't answer directly. Instead, he fixed Jensen with a quiet, measured stare. "Keep it safe. If they come after you, release it. Do it anonymously if you have to." Jensen's fingers curled around the chip like it was a lifeline. He swallowed, throat dry. "Why me?" "Because you still had the decency to try and stop him," Rowan said. "That counts for something." A brief pause passed between them. Outside, the light shifted, the early sunlight breaking through the overcast morning, casting new clarity over the streets. Cars moved like sluggish currents, and in the distance a plane curved upward into the clouds. Jensen looked up again, voice softer now. "So, what are you going to do?" Rowan didn't answer immediately. He turned his head toward the window, watching the people walking by, briefcases in hand, uniforms at their sides. The world was moving forward, but he wasn't leaving it behind. Not this time. His gaze sharpened as if the answer had already been burning behind his calm all along. "I'm going to finish my flight to Arcton and make sure every council member sees what kind of smoke their security division breathes." He flicked a lighter under the CEO's collar, joking as passengers stared in disbelief. "If you believe power without respect destroys itself, hit subscribe now, because justice doesn't burn, it exposes." The first warning came not from a voice but from a silence, the kind that settled too quickly when power moved in shadows. As Rowan Vance stepped through the airport's front entrance flanked by 2 federal escorts, the terminal didn't erupt in noise. It froze. Reporters lowered their microphones mid-question. Travelers paused in mid-step. Cameras flashed, but only once or twice, uncertain whether they were witnessing a walk of shame or something much sharper. Commander Rhys Doran met him before the second security barrier. His stance was squared, arms folded across his chest, expression unreadable beneath the glint of his rank insignia. "Mr. Vance," he said, voice low but firm. "The council's not happy. You're a liability right now." Rowan didn't slow his stride. "No, Commander," he replied, locking eyes with him. "I'm their insurance." Rhys stepped closer, blocking his path. "Meaning?" Rowan leaned in, his tone clipped like a scalpel. "I have proof that your deputy director orchestrated an attack on a federal defense contractor. If I go down, so does your chain of command." Rhys held his stare, the lines around his eyes tightening. He didn't respond, not with words. After a tense beat, he stepped aside, silent permission laced with quiet calculation. As Rowan passed, the air behind him filled with murmurs. Passengers recognized him from the headlines. Some turned to whisper. Others raised phones, capturing fleeting glimpses of the man accused of igniting a fire in the nation's most secure airport. But Rowan didn't falter. Each step was deliberate. His cobalt-blue suit darkened at the cuffs from an earlier rain. His gaze fixed ahead. He passed beneath a row of flickering lights. Overhead, repair crews stood on ladders, replacing scorched ceiling tiles, a patchwork reminder of the moment flame had roared where silence once ruled. The terminal had been restructured since the incident. Metal partitions had been added. Checkpoints doubled, signs updated. Yet none of it changed what still lingered in the air. Tension, stretched taut and humming like a live wire. As he neared Gate B12, a voice rang out over the PA system. "Attention all units. Security protocol lockdown initiated. I repeat, lockdown initiated." Every muscle in Rowan's body tightened. His instincts surged. He pivoted subtly, eyes scanning the crowd. 2 TSA officers moved in at his flanks, one younger, jaw clenched behind his earpiece, the other older, tapping something discreetly on his vest console. Their weapons were holstered, but their posture screamed alert. "What's the reason?" Rowan asked evenly, not stopping. "Routine safety precaution," the older guard replied. "You're advised to remain still until cleared." Rowan said nothing. He already knew this wasn't routine. From the corner of his eye, a flicker of movement caught his attention. A break in the crowd. A man limping slightly, shoulder wrapped in gauze, bandaged hand twitching at his side. Garrett Lorne. And walking beside him, calm, confident, and terrifyingly composed, was Halden Rice. Halden wore a dark coat over a pressed charcoal suit. His expression was almost serene, like a man attending a performance he'd rehearsed for weeks. His eyes met Rowan's with a glint of cold satisfaction. Garrett, on the other hand, burned. Even across the room, Rowan could see it. Rage masked as duty. Wounded pride dressed in a uniform. His steps were heavier than they'd been before, but no less purposeful. He moved like a man rehearsing revenge with every breath. The crowd seemed to dissolve between them. Travelers hurried away, sensing something off. The air took on a charge, as though the ceiling might spark again at any moment. Halden raised his voice, but not much. It cut through the quiet like a scalpel through silk. "Mr. Vance," he said, lips curled into a half-smile, "quite the spectacle you've made." Rowan didn't reply. Halden's gaze flicked toward the guards flanking Rowan. "He'll be escorted for a private hearing before boarding." Simple clearance procedure. The guards didn't look at Rowan. They simply nodded, subtly boxing him in. Rowan's jaw tensed, but he nodded once, giving no resistance. He'd expected this, perhaps not the exact shape of it, but the weight. The theater of control was always loudest when authority felt threatened. As they turned toward the East Wing corridor, he stole one final glance over his shoulder. The lights above Gate B12 dimmed slightly, reacting to a power cycle. Nearby, a ceiling panel still hung loose, exposing wires like frayed nerves. Rowan focused forward again. He didn't need to look back to understand. The trap wasn't over. It had only changed shape. When fire fails, corruption sends smoke instead. Halden's footsteps echoed as he entered the security chamber, each step measured, as if rehearsed. The sealed door behind him thudded shut with mechanical finality, cutting off the distant noise of the terminal. He stood tall, crisp in his charcoal gray uniform, shoulders squared, jaw set in that smug angle that made confrontation feel like ceremony. "Mr. Vance," he began, his voice cool and composed, "quite the spectacle you've made." Rowan said nothing. His hands rested loosely at his sides, though his body remained tense beneath the soaked blue suit that had dried only hours earlier. The chamber's fluorescent lights hummed above them, casting a pale glow over the brushed steel walls and the flat table in the center. A faint scent of metal, rubber, and ozone filled the room, sterile, clinical, like a place designed to erase truth rather than reveal it. "You'll be escorted for a private hearing before boarding," Halden continued with mock formality, circling the table. "Simple clearance procedure." His tone was intentionally light, but each syllable landed like a jab. He didn't wait for Rowan's reply. He didn't need one. Power had already been assumed. Rowan followed as two guards positioned themselves near the door. They didn't speak, but their rigid posture made it clear they weren't just ceremonial. Halden gestured toward the central console mounted on the wall. The screen flickered to life, revealing rows of encrypted transmissions, some highlighted in red, others flashing as active channels. "You tried to expose us," Halden said, his voice softening but turning more lethal. He stepped closer, past the point of professionalism, past even the illusion of civility. "But here's the thing. This isn't a world that listens to saints. The Council doesn't care about good men. They care about survivors." He tapped the tablet. A file opened, time-stamped, classified, unmistakable. "You see this?" he asked, turning the screen to face Rowan. "Data feeds, leaked directly from your Guardian Vault nodes, into servers owned by Cipheral Systems, Licent Holdings. Shall I continue?" Rowan's eyes narrowed slightly, but he did not step back. His pulse remained steady. "You're reaching," he said calmly, though his fingers twitched slightly against the seam of his trousers. Halden chuckled. "No, I'm reminding you. Your halo isn't as clean as you think." His smile turned sharper. "You built Guardian Vault with Council access keys. Those keys unlocked more than defense specs. They opened vulnerabilities. You did that." "Not me." Rowan let the words hang in the air a moment, then replied, his voice even, "I built Guardian Vault to protect national access points. You weaponized it for private gain." The accusation didn't rattle Halden. He leaned in, elbows braced on the edge of the table, voice dropping to a whisper. "You won't make it to Arcton, Vance. The narrative's already written. You're unstable, dangerous, a liability the Council doesn't want." Rowan blinked once. That was all. Then, slowly, as if adjusting his sleeve, he tapped the inner cufflink of his left wrist with two precise fingers. The small motion was hidden beneath the fold of his jacket, too subtle for the guards to notice. But it was enough. The transmitter activated. Far across the city, at Corvion's private data center, a silent pulse was received. A feed initialized, one built by Rowan himself. And from the lining of his jacket, the microphone stitched just below the lapel began transmitting every sound in the room to a secure archive. Halden continued talking, unaware. "They'll pull your funding, blacklist your engineers, revoke your clearances. And if you resist, you'll be the next incident the Council forgets to review." Rowan's lips curved just slightly, a near imperceptible shift. Not a smirk, more like the first flicker of a fuse. You assume I came here to defend myself, he said quietly. But I already knew how this would go. Halden scoffed. You still think you have leverage? I do, Rowan replied. You gave it to me. He tilted his head toward the blinking light embedded discreetly in the ceiling's ventilation shaft. Halden followed the glance instinctively, and then froze. You've been streaming this? He asked, voice no longer calm. Rowan didn't flinch. Everything. From the moment you brought me in, Halden's face twitched. That's illegal. That's truth, Rowan cut in, and truth doesn't need an audience. He paused, stepping forward until they stood nearly shoulder to shoulder, breath mingling between them like steam off a blade. It just needs one microphone. Alarms screamed through the chamber like a siren's judgment. Rhys Doran's voice thundered over the intercom. All units, breach detected in surveillance feed. Secure the chamber immediately. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered violently, casting stuttering shadows along the metallic walls. A low hum rumbled beneath their feet as power rerouted, servers hiccuping before stabilizing on emergency mode. The air, once still, now vibrated with urgency. Halden Rice whipped around, his calm facade dissolving into panic. Who authorized external access? He barked, slamming his palm against the control panel. His fingers stumbled across the interface, trying to trace the intrusion. His breath grew short as his eyes darted from one flickering readout to another, pupils narrowing. Rowan Vance remained absolutely still. He stood at the center of the chaos like the eye of a hurricane, motionless, controlled, watching everything. His eyes were fixed on the small blinking red light nestled in the corner of the ceiling. It pulsed steadily, unwavering. A recording node, live and active. You built the firewall so tight, Rowan said, his voice quiet but cutting through the noise like glass. You forgot to guard the gate. Halden froze. It took him a beat too long to understand, and when it hit, his expression cracked. First confusion, then the slow crawl of dread. His lips parted, then closed. No words came. A sudden blur of motion cut the tension. Garrett Lorne surged forward with a hoarse yell, fury contorting his bandaged face. You smug! But the two guards flanking Rowan reacted immediately, grabbing Garrett mid-lunge. His feet slid on the polished floor, kicking helplessly as he was forced back. One officer wrestled his arms down while the other shoved him toward the wall. Rowan didn't blink. The chamber door slammed open. Control teams in Navy tactical vests flooded the room, weapons holstered but their posture sharp. At the front stood Commander Rhys Doran, holding a control tablet glowing with the live feed. He stopped just inside the threshold, eyes scanning the room before landing on Rowan. Then on Halden. Then, finally, on the blinking red light. Without a word, Rhys raised the tablet and pressed play. Halden's voice, calm, deliberate, unmistakably damning, poured from the speakers. You tried to expose us. You think the Council listens to saints? They listen to survivors. The room went still. Even the distant alarms seemed to fade into silence, replaced by the brittle tension of truth laid bare. You're not clean either, Vance. You built Guardian Vault with classified Council access. I built it to protect access. You weaponized it. Every word rang out in surround sound, every pause more damning than the last. Rhys didn't look up. He didn't need to. Halden took one step back. Wait, this is taken out of context. Don't, Rhys interrupted coldly. His voice had no tremble, only judgment. You're under arrest for conspiracy and evidence tampering. Two officers closed in on Halden. He stiffened, one hand half raised in protest, but the moment he saw the tight grip of the cuffs and the look in Rhys's eyes, he surrendered with a growl of disbelief. I gave everything to this agency, Halden spat. Everything. You think this man, this showboat in a blue suit, did this for justice? He's just another face with a clean shave and a camera crew. Rowan turned slowly. His expression didn't change. There was no triumph in his eyes, only the weight of necessity. "You did this to yourself," Reese said flatly. "You tried to rewrite the rules, but forgot the part where the world is still watching." Garrett, still restrained, shouted from the corner, "He provoked me." "He set me up." Reese's gaze swung sharply toward him, disbelief hardening into contempt. "You lit a man's beard on fire on federal grounds." Garrett's mouth opened again, but the words shriveled in his throat. The command team moved in sync. Halden and Garrett were pulled toward the door, their protests fading into bitter echoes. Only then did Rowan exhale. Not in victory. In release. His shoulders didn't slump, but the breath carried weight. This was not about winning. It never had been. It was about truth, not the kind that made headlines, but the kind that carved its place in silence, in restraint, in the moment after the storm. He turned slowly toward the observation window, the one facing the far end of the terminal. Sunlight had found its way through the sprinkler-misted air. It painted the glass with soft reflections, the particles of vapor catching gold in the beam. Rowan watched for a long time, unmoving, as if remembering something he hadn't yet lived. Behind him, men shuffled, systems rebooted, orders were given, evidence logged. But Rowan didn't move. He placed his hand briefly on the edge of the table, fingertips brushing cool steel, and said softly, his voice barely more than breath, "Justice doesn't shout," he murmured. "It smolders until someone breathes it in." The footage rolled across every major screen before sunrise. Halden Rice's voice, once cold and calculated, now echoed from wall-mounted televisions and news streamers, his confession caught in full, every word broadcast, dissected, paused, and replayed. Anchors leaned forward with grave expressions. Pundits talked over each other, parsing the language of betrayal. Viewers watched as the man who once called the shots behind security partitions was led away in handcuffs, his face pale, lips trembling, eyes refusing to meet the lens. At Corvion Dynamics downtown headquarters, tension buzzed like static through the boardroom. The glass walls, usually bathed in sunlight, felt cold with doubt. Some directors stared silently at the looped footage on the mounted screen while others spoke in hushed tones, their voices wavering between strategy and fear. Trent Maller stood near the far end of the table, arms crossed, eyes burning. "He didn't start the fire," he said, voice cutting through the murmurs. "He revealed where it was burning." One board member, a graying man named Desmond Keir, adjusted his tie with nervous fingers. "We have to think about optics. He's a respected figure, but—" he gestured vaguely toward the screen. "This is a storm, one we may not survive if we anchor ourselves to him." Trent stepped forward, the overhead light glinting off his watch. Rowan didn't go looking for a fight. It found him, and he stood. That's not a liability. That's leadership elsewhere in the city. Inside a dimly lit federal building, Jensen Vale sat beneath a flickering light bulb, his hands folded tightly on the table in front of him. He had already signed the protective agreement. The agents assigned to his case had recorded his testimony twice, but he repeated it again, clear, steady, and without hesitation. "Yes," he said. "Halden Rice ordered Marshal Garrett Lorne to provoke Dr. Vance. They knew the cameras were being monitored. They knew the footage would be incomplete." The lead investigator scribbled a note, but didn't interrupt. Jensen exhaled, his eyes reddened but calm. "They planned it to discredit him before the council vote. They said his program was getting in the way. I didn't think it would go that far, but it did." He looked up. "And it can't be buried anymore." Meanwhile, Garrett Lorne sat alone in a quiet office at the hospital's behavioral wing, bandaged but silent. He didn't speak during his evaluation. The doctor across from him took notes in silence, occasionally studying Garrett's expression, or lack of it. The incident report labeled his behavior as reckless misconduct. But those who knew him saw something deeper, wounded pride that had curdled into cruelty. Back at Corvian, Rowan declined every interview request. Trent handled the PR firm, the press team, even the legal liaisons. Rowan remained focused, buried in data and refining his presentation slides for the federal council. His apartment lights burned late into the night. He did not rehearse his speech aloud. He didn't need to. His thoughts were clear, sharpened by betrayal but fueled by clarity. They had tried to break his composure in public. They'd failed. The best revenge now wasn't exposure, it was endurance. The morning of the council hearing arrived gray and brisk. Security officers stood at every corner of the government complex in Arcton. Reporters waited behind barriers, cameras aimed at the steps. When Rowan exited his car, he wore the same blue suit, freshly pressed. His beard was neatly trimmed, no scorch marks, no uneven lines. Just steadiness. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't need to. Inside the chamber, silence followed his entrance like a tide. The council members, 12 men in dark suits, sat rigidly behind a long mahogany table. Each had reviewed the footage. Each had read the leaked internal memos. And each had seen the data trails Corvian uncovered following the attack. It was no longer a matter of if. It was a matter of how long had they known. Rowan approached the central podium, the only sound his footsteps and the faint hum of the overhead lights. He paused, adjusted the microphone, and looked each councilman in the eye. His voice, when it came, was calm, but it carried a weight none could ignore. "If integrity costs comfort," Rowan said, "then it's a price worth paying." Several members shifted in their seats. A few glanced at one another. No one spoke, and Rowan stood still, his reflection faintly visible on the polished podium, his eyes steady as ever. He had walked through the storm, but he hadn't flinched. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't struck back. He had simply endured, and in doing so, revealed every crack in the structure around him. The silence in the chamber remained heavy, but something had shifted. Respect didn't arrive with applause. It arrived with recognition, of restraint, of resolve, of quiet power. And as the final slide of his presentation loaded behind him, and the lights dimmed for the projection, Rowan knew they were no longer judging if he belonged. They were realizing they might not. Truth doesn't need applause. It just needs endurance. The anonymous file dropped at 3:47 a.m. It wasn't a press leak or a news report. It was a surgical strike. A dense packet of digital documents, timestamps, and voice transcriptions dumped onto a fringe network under a burner alias, Vance Fabricates. Within hours, fragments began circulating across low-tier news sites and whisper chains on encrypted forums. The headline was bait. Was the airport fire a staged PR stunt? By sunrise, it was trending. Rowan stood at the center of Corvian's glass-walled operations floor, watching a silent reel of headlines flicker across the main screen. None used his full name, but the implication was loud. Images of the fire-drenched terminal, the half-burnt uniform, and the instant Rowan had held the lighter back against Garrett's collar, all replayed with captions twisted to serve suspicion. "They're trying to flip it," Trent said, slamming the news tablet on Rowan's desk. "They're dragging you into the dirt." Again, Rowan didn't look away from the screen. "We knew it would come," he said softly. "They're saying you hired Garrett." That the whole thing was choreographed to promote Guardian Vault, Rowan finally turned. His eyes were calm, but there was iron behind the silence. And yet, no one's asking why the lighter was in his hand. Trent's jaw flexed. "We should sue." "Slam them with everything we've got." Rowan opened his laptop and closed it just as fast. "No. We stay ahead by building, not barking. While they talk, we build." The next day, Corvian launched the beta of a new project. A transparency module for federal networks. One that could track and log every override, breach, or modification to internal surveillance systems. It was subtle in name, but sharp in purpose. The council had no choice but to acknowledge its value. They named it the Vance Protocol. And that's when the phone rang. "Rowan," came the voice of Rhys Doran, now elevated as interim head of the Ethics Commission. His voice was cautious but clear. "This protocol, it's going to make enemies." Rowan stood at the window, watching the skyline smear under the fading dusk. "Truth usually does." "They'll come after you again," Rhys said quietly. Rowan didn't flinch. "Then I'll make sure the next fire alarm doesn't need a flame." He hung up. Silence followed, the kind that only came after war drums had stopped, when both sides began loading the next round in darkness. Rowan knew this wasn't about him anymore. Not Garrett. Not even Halden. This was about rot. The kind that wore polished shoes and sat at polished tables. He no longer cared for their applause or their warnings. Because war, he realized, had changed its costume. It didn't wear rifles anymore. It wore policies. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the desk, matching the hum of Corvian servers cycling in the background. In a locked drawer beneath him, an untouched file sat sealed in foil. The original backup logs from Camera 12. Insurance. Not for himself. For the system that might one day need to be reminded how it once tried to burn a man for standing still. Some battles end when you stop fighting. Others end when the system finally looks in the mirror. Rain slicked the tarmac outside Haverleen Terminal, but inside the air was dry and electric with quiet movement. Conveyor belts rolled with the rhythm of a ticking clock, and the fluorescent lights hummed above like a system slowly exhaling. Dr. Rowan Vance stepped through the sliding doors unnoticed at first. No entourage, no press, just the measured footsteps of a man returning not to conquer, but to confirm that something broken had been rebuilt. He walked slowly, past families wrangling suitcases, past suits clutching coffee, past the checkpoint that had once been a battlefield. His bright blue suit was neatly pressed, his beard groomed but untouched by flame, his posture straight as a steel beam. No badge this time. No council escort. Just a man retracing a path through ashes long since swept. The checkpoint had changed. Rows were more orderly. Officers moved with precision, speaking in clipped but respectful tones. Screens displayed transparent protocol logs, small windows of code showing override records, timestamps, and clearance validations. The tech was familiar. He had written part of it himself. And then, from across the room, a voice. "Never thought I'd see you back here, sir." Rowan turned. Jensen Vale stood just beyond the barrier, uniform crisp, his stance more confident than Rowan remembered. The younger officer smiled, not with nervous gratitude this time, but with quiet pride. Rowan nodded once. "You fix a place best by walking through it again." They met near the edge of the old screening zone, an unspoken landmark. Here was where Garrett Lorne had flicked the lighter. Here was where a spark nearly rewrote a man's life. Rowan glanced toward the ceiling. The scorch marks were long painted over, but he remembered every flicker of that firestorm. Jensen followed his gaze. "Funny," he said softly. "I still expect to smell smoke sometimes." Rowan offered the faintest of smiles. Smoke lingers where fire teaches. The two men stood there in silence, surrounded by the low murmur of a functioning system. A child laughed somewhere behind them. An officer guided an elderly man gently through a secondary screening. Another stood at attention but didn't intimidate, he instructed patiently. Small changes, crucial ones. "We're running drills now," Jensen said, gesturing toward a nearby console. "Randomized. Transparent. Logged in real time." Rowan looked to the monitor. It displayed a drill just completed. TSA override simulation, 2 minutes 31 seconds, 0 escalation, protocol adherence, 100%. A banner slid across the bottom. System clear. "Better?" Rowan asked, not prideful, just verifying. Jensen nodded. "Better. not perfect, but we know the difference now. A moment passed, then came the announcement over the intercom, clean and routine. Routine safety drill complete, system clear. Rowan looked up at the lights above. They didn't flicker. No alarms wailed. No guards rushed to restrain. Just silence, order, and a strange, welcome normal. He turned back toward the walkway, preparing to leave. As he moved past the rows of screens, he caught his reflection in the glass. No smoke, no flame, just calm eyes, steady hands, and the quiet strength of someone who had walked through chaos without carrying it forward. Behind him, Jensen spoke again. "It's strange. Everything feels quieter." Rowan paused, then said it without turning, his voice clear and measured. "That's what peace sounds like. It's just order without fear." He tried to spark humiliation and ended up triggering chaos that revealed his own shame. If you believe arrogance always lights its own downfall, subscribe now, because justice always finds a flame of truth. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, humiliation, and the power shift that comes when dignity triumphs over cruelty. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage reflection on respect, accountability, and justice in everyday encounters.